on August 20th, 1966. The humidity in Niterói was stifling. Just across the bay from Rio de Janeiro, the city lay under a blanket of tropical heat that often follows a week of relentless rain. It was a Saturday, the kind of day that usually draws people to the coast. But for an 18-year-old boy named Jorge da Costa Alves, the day belonged to the hills. Jorge had trekked into the dense brush of Morro do Vintém, a steep and rugged hill known more for its scrubby vegetation and difficult terrain than for casual hiking. He was searching for a spot to fly his kite, hoping to catch the wind that whipped around the upper slopes of the topography. As Jorge pushed through the wet undergrowth, the scent of damp earth and vegetation was overwhelmed by a different, sharper odor. It was a smell that triggers a primal alarm in the human brain, sweet and cloying. He followed the scent toward a small clearing where the brush had been tamped down. There, lying side by side in the tall grass, were two men. They were dressed not for a hike in the rough terrain, but for a business meeting. They wore matching formal suits, ties, and expensive-looking waterproof raincoats. Jorge did not stay to investigate. The stillness of the figures and the swarm of flies told him everything he needed to know. He ran back down the muddy slopes of Morro do Vintém and alerted the authorities. The local police, already stretched thin and dealing with the logistical nightmare of the difficult terrain, did not ascend the hill immediately. By the time a small team of officers, accompanied by firefighters, made the climb the following day, the scene had been preserved in a grim tableaus by the isolation of the location. What the investigators found on that Sunday morning would transform a double homicide or suicide investigation into one of the most enduring anomalies in Brazilian history. The two men were lying on their backs. There were no signs of a struggle. The wet grass around them was relatively undisturbed, suggesting they had laid themselves down voluntarily or had been overcome with sudden, incapacitating force. But it was their faces that stopped the police in their tracks. Resting over the eyes of both men were crude, hand-fashioned lead masks. These were not theatrical masks or disguises intended to hide identity. They were shaped like sunglasses, cut roughly from a sheet of lead, designed to shield the eyes from something specific. They resembled the makeshift protection a welder might use, or perhaps something a technician would fashion to block out intense radiation. The lead masks gave the case its name, but the rest of the inventory found on the bodies only deepened the mystery. The men were identified as Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana. They were electronics technicians from Campos dos Goitacazes, a town located several hours to the northeast. Manuel was 32 and Miguel was 34. Both were married, both were respected in their communities, and both had a known interest in spiritualism and scientific experimentation, two fields that often overlapped in the cultural milieu of 1966 Brazil. Next to the bodies, police found an empty water bottle and a packet containing 2 wet towels. There was no weapon. There was no note of suicide. However, inside the pocket of one of the suits, investigators discovered a small notebook. The pages were damp, but the ink had survived the rain. The contents were brief, cryptic, and written in a tone of instructional urgency. The note read as follows: 4:30 B at the determined place. 6:30 swallow capsules. After effect, protect metal's weight for signal mask. This singular piece of evidence turned a tragic discovery into a baffling puzzle. The timeline, the capsules, the protection of metals, and the waiting for a signal suggested a planned event, a ritual, or an experiment that had gone terribly wrong. To understand how Manuel and Miguel ended up dead on a hill in Niterói with lead over their eyes, investigators had to retrace their final steps, a journey that began 3 days earlier. On August 17th, the 2 men had left Campos dos Goitacazes by bus. They had told their families they were traveling to Sao Paulo to purchase a used car and some electronic components for their business. They were carrying a significant amount of cash, roughly 3 million cruzeiros. This money would later become a point of contention, as only a fraction of it was found on the bodies, leading some to theorize robbery. However, the expensive watches on their wrists were untouched, and the strange nature of the crime scene did not fit the profile of a simple mugging. The bus ride brought them to Niterói, arriving around 2 in the afternoon during a torrential downpour. The weather was atrocious, with rain lashing the city and turning the dirt paths of the favelas and hills into mudslides. Despite the weather, the men proceeded with a strange itinerary. They went to a specialized shop where they purchased the waterproof raincoats found on their bodies. This purchase suggests they knew they would be exposed to the elements, likely waiting in the rain for the appointment mentioned in the notebook. After buying the coats, they stopped at a bar to purchase a bottle of mineral water. The witness at the bar, a waitress, later told police that Miguel appeared nervous. He kept checking his watch, glancing at the door, and seemed anxious about the time. Manuel, by contrast, seemed calm. They did not buy alcohol. They bought water, presumably to aid in swallowing the capsules mentioned in the note. The waitress noted that they held onto the receipt for the bottle, a receipt that was later found at the crime scene, confirming the timeline. From the bar, the trail becomes murky. The 2 men, dressed in their suits and clutching their new raincoats and water bottle, made their way to the base of Morro do Vintém. The ascent would have been grueling in the rain. The hill is not a manicured park. It is a wild overgrown mound of earth rising sharply from the urban landscape. Doing so in dress shoes and suits implies a supreme dedication to their destination. They were not wandering aimlessly. They were heading to the determined place. Based on the autopsy reports and the decomposition of the bodies, it is believed they died sometime late on August 17th or early August 18th. This aligns with the times listed in the notebook. If they arrived at the spot by 4:30 in the afternoon as instructed, they would have been sitting in the rain, watching the gray sky darken over Rio across the water. At 6:30, as twilight turned to night, they presumably swallowed the capsules. The toxicology reports, unfortunately, were inconclusive. By the time the coroner examined the organs, decomposition had advanced too far to reliably detect specific poisons or drugs. There was no evidence of cyanide, no evidence of violence, and no obvious cause of death, such as a heart attack. Their hearts simply stopped. It was as if they had turned off. The concept of the lead masks suggests a fear of or preparation for light or radiation. In the 1960s, the intersection of ufology and spiritualism was potent. Many groups believed that contact with extraterrestrial entities required mental and physical preparation. The instructions to protect metals and wait for a signal mask align with the lore of the time, which often warned that contact events could involve intense luminosities that could blind the unprepared, or magnetic fields that could interfere with metal objects. The instruction to protect metals is particularly intriguing given their profession. As electronics technicians, Manuel and Miguel would have been intimately familiar with soldering, circuits, and the properties of lead. They were not naive about materials. They had fashioned the masks themselves in their workshop back in Campos. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, but a premeditated plan involving technical preparation. The location itself, Morro do Vintém, offers few clues. It is not known as a particular hotspot for UFO sightings compared to other regions in Brazil. Nor was it a common meeting place for spiritualist groups. It was simply a high, secluded place. However, a local resident reported seeing a strange, luminous orange object hovering over the hill on the night the men died. This testimony, while impossible to verify, added a layer of paranormal speculation that the press seized upon immediately. Yet the investigative journalist must look at the human element. Who gave the instructions? The note was written in the notebook, but the phrasing implies they were following orders from a third party. Be at the determined place. Swallow capsules. It reads like a recipe given by a mentor or a guide. Police investigations later revealed that the men had been communicating with other local figures involved in scientific spiritualism, a group sought to bridge the gap between technology and the beyond. There were rumors of an unknown man who met them at the bus station. Or perhaps they were meeting someone on the hill. But no footprints other than their own were definitively identified in the area, though the rain would have washed away most traces. If a third party was present, they left no physical evidence, took the money, but left the watches and the expensive raincoats. The image remains hauntingly vivid more than half a century later. Two men sitting in the pouring rain on a desolate hill, checking their watches as the designated hour approached. They put on their raincoats to stay dry. They opened the water bottle. They took out the capsules, whatever they contained, perhaps a psychedelic to induce a trance, perhaps a poison disguised as a sacrament, or perhaps something they truly believed would elevate them to another plane of existence. They placed the crude lead masks over their eyes, plunging themselves into darkness, and lay back in the wet grass. They waited for a signal. Whether that signal ever came, or whether they simply drifted into the sleep of death while the rain drummed against their waterproof coats, remains the silence at the heart of the case. The incident on Morro du Vintém stands as a locked-room mystery where the room is an open hill, and the key is a pair of lead masks that stare blindly back at anyone trying to look in. The investigation that followed would attempt to peel back the layers of their lives in Campos, their associates, and the strange books found in their workshops. But the physical reality of their death, the suits, the masks, the note, remains a stubborn, irreducible fact. They went up the hill to see something, and they dressed their eyes to survive the sight. The terrain of Vintém Hill is unforgiving, a topographical scar of rough shrubbery and clay rising above the bustling life of Niterói, Brazil. When the police finally ascended that slope on August 20th, 1966, led by an 18-year-old boy who had stumbled upon the scene while hunting for birds, they were not walking into a typical crime scene. They were stepping into a tableau that defied every conventional logic of forensic science. What lay waiting for them in the tall grass was not merely a tragedy, but a collection of anomalies so bizarre that they would paralyze the investigation before it even truly began. The first and most striking anomaly was the visual dissonance of the bodies themselves. Lying side by side in the wet undergrowth were Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana. They were not dressed for a hike through thorny scrubland. They were not dressed for a clandestine meeting in the mud. They were dressed for a funeral, or perhaps a business meeting in a high-rise office. Both men wore formal suits, pressed trousers, and dress shirts. Yet, layered over this formal attire, they wore identical waterproof raincoats. It was a jarring juxtaposition, the mundane formality of the suits clashing with the utilitarian, almost clinical appearance of the raincoats. It gave the impression that they were prepared for an event that required both respectability and protection from the elements, or perhaps protection from something else entirely. But the eyes drew the most attention. Resting over the face of each man was a mask made of lead. These were not intricate, theatrical masks, nor were they industrial safety gear. They were crude, hand-cut shapes, fashioned roughly in the form of sunglasses, designed to cover the eyes completely. They had no straps, no holes for vision, and no discernible method of being secured to the head other than gravity. They simply sat there, heavy and opaque, blocking out the world. The existence of these masks shifted the narrative immediately from a robbery or a murder to something ritualistic or pseudo-scientific. Lead is a heavy metal known for one primary function in the mid-20th century, which is shielding against radiation. Why two electronic technicians would walk up a hill, lie down, and place radiation shields over their eyes became the question that would haunt every subsequent discovery. As the investigators cataloged the scene, the inventory of items found next to the bodies only deepened the mystery. There were no weapons. There were no signs of a struggle. The grass around them was undisturbed, suggesting they had lain down voluntarily and simply expired. Alongside the bodies lay an empty water bottle and a packet containing 2 wet towels. The presence of the towels was particularly baffling. If they were there to wipe away sweat or rain, why were they found packed away? If they were part of a ritual, their function was unknown. However, the centerpiece of the anomalies, the artifact that would spawn 1,000 theories, was a small notebook found in the pocket of one of the men. Inside, written in a hurried grammatical shorthand that suggested a reminder rather than a manifesto, were instructions. The text has been translated and analyzed for decades, but its simplicity remains its most chilling aspect. The note read that at 4:30 in the afternoon, they were to be at the agreed-upon place. It continued with the instruction that at 6:30, they were to swallow capsules. Following this, the note read, "After effect, protect metal's weight for signal mask." This singular scrap of paper transformed the case from a physical mystery to a psychological one. The timeline was rigid. The instructions were specific. The mention of capsules suggested a premeditated ingestion of a substance. But what substance? And for what purpose? The phrase "protect metals" is arguably the most cryptic. In the context of the lead masks, it implies a belief that they needed to shield themselves from a powerful force. Was it a spiritual energy they believed would manifest? Was it the radiation of an extraterrestrial craft? A common obsession in the zeitgeist of 1966? Or was it a misunderstanding of scientific principles by 2 men who tinkered with electronics and perhaps dabbled in things they did not fully understand. The anomalies extended beyond the physical evidence into the timeline of their final hours. Reconstructing their movements revealed a pattern of behavior that oscillated between purposeful and nervous. They had arrived in Niterói by bus, having traveled a significant distance from their hometown. They carried a large sum of money, ostensibly to purchase a car or electronic components. Yet, very little cash was found on the bodies. This initially pointed toward robbery. Yet the thief, if there was one, had left behind the expensive watches on their wrists and the lead masks on their faces. A robber motivated by greed does not typically take the time to carefully reposition lead masks over the eyes of their victims. Furthermore, the water bottle found at the scene provided a mundane but confusing breadcrumb. Police traced the bottle to a local bar where the men had stopped hours before their death. The witness, a waitress, recalled them appearing anxious. Miguel had checked his watch repeatedly, acting as if they were running against a countdown. They purchased the water, but significantly, they kept the deposit receipt for the bottle. This small, bureaucratic detail is inconsistent with men who intended to commit suicide. People walking to their deaths rarely worry about the deposit return on a glass bottle. It suggests they planned to return. They planned to come back down the hill. Whatever was supposed to happen up there, in their minds, was temporary. The condition of the bodies presented the next major anomaly. By the time the police and the coroner reached them, the men had been dead for approximately 3 days. The heat and humidity of a Brazilian August should have accelerated decomposition significantly. Yet the initial reports described the bodies as being in a surprisingly preserved state. Even more unsettling were the reports from the locals and the initial responding officers that there was no smell. In a tropical climate, 3 days of death creates an undeniable olfactory presence. Yet the air on Vintém Hill was reportedly clean. Adding to the biological oddities was the interaction, or lack thereof, with the local fauna. Vintém Hill was home to vultures and scavengers. Typically, a body left in the open for 72 hours would show signs of predation. However, the bodies of Manuel and Miguel were intact. It was as if the local wildlife had instinctively avoided the area. This detail, often cited in paranormal investigations, adds a layer of primal wrongness to the scene. Nature usually reclaims organic matter quickly. Here, nature seemed to have recoiled. The investigation itself became an anomaly of incompetence and lost opportunities. The police, perhaps overwhelmed by the strangeness of the scene, or simply lacking the resources for such a complex case, failed to secure the area properly. By the time the coroner began his work, the The internal organs of the men were too badly decomposed to run effective toxicology screens. The one crucial question raised by the notebook, what capsules did they swallow, was rendered unanswerable by the passage of time and the failures of the forensic process. They could test for basic poisons, possibly. But if the men had ingested a complex hallucinogen, a rapidly degrading neurotoxin, or a novel chemical compound, the evidence had vanished into the cellular breakdown of their own tissues. We must also consider the weather. On the night they died, a heavy rainstorm lashed the area. The men were wearing raincoats, which suggests they anticipated the weather. Or perhaps the rain was coincidental. But the rain did more than soak their suits. It washed the hill. Any footprints, any trace of a third party, any residue of the capsules that might have fallen to the ground, all of it was scrubbed away by the deluge. The water acted as a great eraser, leaving only the insoluble facts, the lead, the bodies, and the note. There is also the matter of the geographical location. Vintém Hill is not a place of significance. It is not a known meeting point for cults, nor is it a tourist destination. It is a nondescript rise in the land. Why there? The note mentioned the agreed place. Who agreed to it? The choice of location implies prior knowledge or instruction from a third party. Two men from out of town do not simply pick a random, difficult-to-access hill in a strange city without guidance. This points toward the existence of a guide, a mentor, or a deceiver who lured them there. The final anomaly of the scene lies in the absence of the capsules themselves. The note explicitly commanded them to swallow the capsules, assuming they followed the instructions, and the positioning of the bodies suggests they followed the ritual to the end. There should have been some container, a bottle, a wrapper, a box. Yet no container for the capsules was found. Did they consume the container? Did they throw it into the thick brush where it was never found? Or did a third person administer the capsules and take the evidence with them? The missing container is a void in the narrative, a physical gap that supports the theory of a third participant who walked away while Manuel and Miguel lay down to wait for a signal that never came. As the police cleared the bodies from the hill, struggling down the muddy slopes with stretchers, they left behind a scene that refused to fit into any box. It was not clearly murder, for there was no violence. It was not clearly suicide, for the receipt and the return tickets suggested future plans. It was not clearly an accident, for the masks and the note proved intent. The anomalies of the lead mask's case created a vacuum of logic, a space where facts were replaced by symbols. The suit, the mask, the capsule. And in that vacuum, the silence of Vintém Hill grew louder, amplifying the mystery of what exactly two technicians were hoping to see through eyes covered in lead. The autopsy room in Niterói was stiflingly hot, a humid box of stagnant air that seemed to preserve the smell of death rather than ventilate it. It was here, under the harsh glare of overhead lights, that the first and perhaps most significant dead end of the lead mask's case was reached. Dr. Astor Pereira de Milo, a seasoned coroner accustomed to the grisly reality of urban violence, found himself staring at a puzzle that refused to fit together. The bodies of Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana lay before him, advanced in their decomposition, but surprisingly intact regarding trauma. There were no bullet holes, no stab wounds, no ligature marks on their necks, and no blunt force trauma to their skulls. To the naked eye, the technicians had simply ceased to exist. Their hearts had stopped, but the biological narrative of why they stopped was missing. In a typical homicide investigation, the body screams the cause of its own demise. Here, the silence was deafening. The coroner searched for needle marks, thinking perhaps they had been forcibly injected with something, but found nothing. He looked for signs of a struggle, defensive wounds on the hands or arms, but the men appeared to have died lying down, resting peacefully on their bed of patanga leaves. The only tangible evidence of their final moments was the bizarre inventory found on their person. Items that seemed to belong to a ritual rather than a robbery. This absence of violence shifted the entire weight of the investigation onto toxicology. If the killer was not a gun or a knife, it had to be a chemical. The police were desperate for the lab results, pinning their hopes on the contents of the stomach and the condition of the internal organs to reveal a poison. It was the logical next step, the procedural safety net that would catch what the naked eye had missed. But the universe seemed to conspire against the investigation due to the bureaucratic sluggishness of the Brazilian legal system in 1966 and the overwhelmed state of the Forensics Institute. The organs were removed, but not immediately tested. They sat in preservation jars, waiting for a slot in the queue. By the time the toxicological analysis was finally attempted weeks later, the samples were too degraded to yield a definitive result. The press reported that the organs had been mishandled or that the preservation fluid was inadequate, but the result was the same. The science had failed. Whether the men had swallowed cyanide, a heavy sedative, or some esoteric hallucinogen, the chemical footprint had vanished into the noise of decomposition. The police were left with a null result. Cause of death remained undetermined. This was the first major door to slam shut in the face of the detectives. Without a biological cause of death, the investigation turned to the physical evidence, specifically the cryptic note found in the pocket of one of the men. It was a small notebook, the kind used for grocery lists or quick reminders. But the writing inside was anything but mundane. It read like a set of instructions for a mission, written in a clipped, imperative tone. Be at the agreed place at 4:30 in the afternoon. At 6:30, swallow the capsules. After the effect, protect metals. Wait for the mask signal. This note became the obsession of the police force. It implied a third party, a commander or a guide who had issued these orders. The handwriting was identified as belonging to one of the victims, implying he was taking dictation from someone else. The timeline was precise. They had arrived at the hill. They had waited. But what were the capsules? And what was the mask signal? The mention of protecting metals added a layer of pseudoscientific flavor to the mystery, aligning with the men's known interest in electronics and spiritualism. It suggested they believed they were about to be exposed to some form of radiation or energy that would damage their watches or the components they worked with. Detectives scoured the pharmacies of Niterói and the victim's hometown of Campos dos Goitacazes. They were looking for anyone who remembered selling capsules to two men matching their description. But a capsule is a generic vessel. It could have contained anything from aspirin to arsenic, without the toxicology report to confirm what was in their stomachs. The capsules remained a terrifying variable. If they were poison, was it suicide? The layout of the bodies suggested calmness, not the thrashing agony usually associated with poisoning. If they were drugs intended to induce a trance, perhaps the dosage had been accidentally lethal. The investigation then pivoted to the human element. If the men were following instructions, who gave them? The police focused their attention on a friend of the victims, a man named Elcio Gomes. Elcio ran in the same circles of spiritual experimentation and amateur electronics. He had been seen with them shortly before their trip to Niterói. The police brought him in for intense questioning, sensing that he was the key to unlocking the code of the notebook. Elcio admitted that he knew the men and that they were involved in experiments that blended science with the occult, trying to communicate with beings from other planets or dimensions. However, Elcio was a dead end in human form. He provided alibis. He denied knowing the specific details of this particular trip. He painted a picture of Manuel and Miguel as enthusiasts who were constantly chasing the next great spiritual breakthrough, often keeping the specifics secretive even from their closest friends. The police grilled him for hours, trying to catch him in a contradiction. They suspected he might be the third man, the one who took the money the men were rumored to be carrying. The financial angle was another path that petered out into nothingness. Family members claimed the men had brought a significant amount of cash with them, roughly 3 million cruzeiros, intended for the purchase of a used car or electronic equipment. When the bodies were found, the money was gone. This pointed to robbery. But if it was a robbery, why leave the expensive watches? Why leave the gold rings? Why leave the lead masks themselves, which had required effort to fashion? A common thief picks a pocket and runs. They do not force their victims to construct lead eye guards, lie down on leaves, and swallow capsules on a strict schedule. The robbery theory felt like a square peg jammed into a round hole. It explained the missing cash, but failed to explain the tableau of the scene. It was possible that a thief had stumbled upon the bodies after they died and simply took the cash, leaving the weirder items behind out of superstition or fear. But this was pure speculation. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation fragmented into a dozen different directions, all of them leading nowhere. There were reports of a blonde man seen talking to the victims near the station, a figure that became something of a phantom in the case files. Sketches were drawn and citizens were interviewed, but the blonde man never materialized. He became just another ghost story attached to the hill. The police also delved into the local spiritualist community, specifically a group described as scientific spiritualists. These were not traditional mediums, but people who believed that electronics and radio waves could bridge the gap between the living and the dead, or the earth and the stars. The police raided houses and seized books, hoping to find a manual that described the ritual performed on Vintém Hill. They found evidence of similar experiments, strange, jagged antennas, and diagrams of the cosmos, but nothing that specifically prescribed the lead masks and the capsules. The community was tight-knit and defensive, viewing the police as unenlightened interlopers who could not understand the high science they were practicing. They offered no concrete leads, only vague talk of energies and vibrations. The physical environment of Vintém Hill offered no help either. The heavy rains that fell in the days between the death of the men and the discovery of the bodies had washed the scene clean. Any footprints, cigarette butts, or tire tracks that might have pointed to a vehicle or a third person were gone, carried away by the mud. The hill kept its secrets. The police even staged a reenactment, trying to time the walk from the road to the spot where the bodies lay, to see if it matched the schedule in the notebook. It proved that the timeline was physically possible, but it did not explain the why. The lead masks themselves sat in the evidence locker, staring blindly at the detectives. They were crude, cut from a sheet of lead with reckless haste, likely with tin snips. They were not mass-produced. They were made specifically for this event. Experts analyzed the lead, hoping to trace it to a specific hardware store or supplier. But it was standard industrial material, available anywhere. The masks were the defining symbol of the case, yet they offered zero forensic value. They were props in a play where the script had been lost. Ultimately, the investigation was strangled by a lack of hard data. There was no murder weapon, no cause of death, no witness, and no confession. The third man remained a theory. The capsules remained unidentified. The signal they were waiting for never came, or if it did, it left no trace on this earth. The case of the lead masks did not end with a gavel banging in a courtroom. It ended with a sigh of exhaustion from a police force that had run out of road. The dossier was eventually shelved, becoming a dusty artifact in the archives of Rio de Janeiro crime. A collection of papers that documented not a solution, but a profound and disturbing failure to understand what had happened on that rainy hill. The dead ends were not just stops in the road. They formed a labyrinth from which the truth never escaped. The narrative of Manuel and Miguel simply stopped, suspended in time at 6:30 in the evening, waiting for a signal that the rest of the world could not hear. The small notebook found beside the bodies of Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana remains one of the most chilling artifacts in the history of unexplained deaths. It is not merely a piece of evidence. It is a script for a tragedy, penned in the confident hand of men who believed they were on the verge of a transcendental breakthrough. When I hold the facsimile of those pages, I am struck by the banality of the handwriting, contrasted with the surreal nature of the commands. There is no panic in the strokes of the pen, no tremor of fear. These were instructions written with the calm precision of a technical manual. Yet they directed two healthy men to march into the void. The timeline dictated in the notebook is sparse, leaving vast canyons of silence for us to fill with speculation. 4:30 in the afternoon, arrive at the agreed place. 6:30 in the afternoon, swallow capsules. After the effect, protect metals, wait for signal mask. These words, translated from the original Portuguese, form the spine of the mystery. But it is the final command that haunts the investigation. The signal. What signal were they waiting for on that rain-swept incline of Vintém Hill? And more importantly, did it ever arrive? To understand the weight of that word, we must look beyond the immediate crime scene and delve into the professional lives of the victims. Manuel and Miguel were not mystics in the traditional sense. They were electronics technicians. They spent their days surrounded by the hum of vacuum tubes, the smell of soldering iron, and the logic of circuit boards. In 1966, television and radio were the cutting edge of consumer technology in Brazil, and these men were the masters of that domain. They understood that invisible waves could carry voices and images across vast distances. It is not a difficult leap to imagine they believed similar principles could be applied to the metaphysical. The concept of scientific spiritualism was gaining traction in the region at the time. It was a belief system that stripped away the superstition of old world seances and replaced it with the terminology of the space age. Enthusiasts believed that contact with other worlds or dimensions was not a matter of chanting and candles, but of tuning the right frequency. The notebook suggests that Manuel and Miguel viewed their excursion to Vintém Hill not as a ritual, but as an experiment. They were technicians setting up a receiver, and their own bodies were the antennas. The instruction to protect metals is particularly telling. In the context of electronics, protecting metals usually refers to shielding sensitive components from interference or damage caused by strong electromagnetic fields. If they believed the signal they were waiting for was a burst of high-intensity radiation or a powerful magnetic pulse, their strange behavior begins to align with a twisted sort of logic. They removed the foil wrappers from their pockets. They wore lead masks, shaped like sunglasses, presumably to shield their eyes from a blinding light or radiation that would accompany the signal. They were preparing for a physical event, an arrival that would manifest with the force of a lightning strike. I traveled to Niterói to walk the path they took, trying to see the landscape through the eyes of men, expecting a miracle. The hill itself is steep, covered in dense vegetation that clings to the clay soil. In August, the winter rains turn the ground into slick mud. It is an uncomfortable place to wait. The police reports state that the men arrived at the designated spot and sat on their coats, using them as barriers against the damp earth. They had an empty water bottle, presumably used to wash down the capsules mentioned in the note. The toxicology reports were inconclusive, the organs too decomposed by the time the autopsy was performed to identify specific poisons. But the intent is clear. They ingested something at 6:30. Then they waited. The sun would have set, plunging the hill into darkness. The lights of the city below would have been flickering, distant stars in a terrestrial galaxy. But the men were looking upward. There are whispers in the local lore that they were not alone in their anticipation. Reports from the time mention a local night watchman who claimed to see a luminous, orange object hovering over Vintém Hill on that specific night. He described it as silent and bright, casting a strange glow over the ridge where the bodies were later found. While such testimonies are often dismissed as hysteria or misidentification, in the context of the lead masks case, the account acts as a disturbing corroboration. If the men were waiting for a signal, and a witness saw a strange light at the exact location and time of their death, we are forced to confront the possibility that the experiment worked, at least in their eyes. However, the silence of the aftermath is deafening. The men were found days later, undisturbed. There were no signs of a struggle, no violence, no robbery. They simply lay down and died. The lead masks were found resting beside them, as if they had slipped off or been removed after the fact. This detail adds a layer of confusion to the narrative. If the masks were essential for protection against the signal, why were they not strapped tight? Or perhaps the signal came and went, leaving them incapacitated before they could fully prepare. I spoke with a retired engineer who specializes in vintage radio equipment to understand the mindset of a technician in the 60s. He explained that in the early days of radio, there was a pervasive belief among amateurs that the static between stations held secret messages. He suggested that Manuel and Miguel might have been part of a fringe group attempting to build a biological radio. The capsules, he theorized, could have been intended to induce a hypersensitive state, altering their neurochemistry to perceive frequencies the human ear cannot hear. The lead masks would then serve to focus this perception, blocking out visual noise just as a lead shield blocks X-rays. In this view, the signal was not a UFO, but a transmission. This theory aligns with other oddities found in their workshop back in Campos dos Goitacazes. Police found scraps of lead, strange wiring diagrams, and books on spiritualism. They also found evidence of a previous, failed experiment at Atafona Beach, where a massive explosion had occurred months prior. It seems Vintém Hill was not a singular event, but the culmination of a dangerous obsession. They were refining their methodology, moving from volatile explosives to internal chemistry. The phrase "wait for signal" implies a passive role, but in the context of their preparation, it was an active engagement. They were syncing their internal clocks with an external event. The tragedy lies in the possibility that the signal was a fabrication, a lie sold to them by a third party, or a delusion born of their own desire to transcend the mundane. Yet the watchman's report of the orange light lingers. It prevents us from closing the book on the extraterrestrial or paranormal angle entirely. As I stood on the hill, the wind rustling through the tall grass, I tried to imagine the final moments of Manuel and Miguel. The drugs taking hold, the cold seeping through their waterproof coats, the absolute darkness of the clouds blotting out the stars. Did they feel fear as the paralysis set in? Or did they feel a sense of triumph, believing the numbness was the precursor to the signal they craved? The note ends with the word mask. It is a final punctuation mark, a command to seal themselves off from the world. Once the signal was received, or perhaps once the effect took hold, they were to don the masks and enter the next phase. The fact that the masks were found beside them might suggest they never reached that final stage. They died waiting, Or perhaps they removed them in a moment of panic when the effect became something far more agonizing than spiritual enlightenment. The lingering signal of Vintém Hill is not a radio wave or a beam of light. It is the resonance of their belief. It is the echo of a time when technology and magic were indistinguishable to those desperate for answers. The men died, protecting themselves from a force that may have never existed, following instructions for a meeting that was never meant to happen. Or, in the most unsettling interpretation, the signal did arrive, and the lead masks were simply insufficient to shield them from the truth. Investigating the lead masks themselves offers another avenue of unease. They were crude, hand-fashioned from sheet lead. I examined photographs of similar masks used in radiological work from that era. Professional shielding is thick, heavy, and covers the entire face. The masks found on the hill were more symbolic than functional, barely covering the eyes. If they were intended to block actual radiation, they were woefully inadequate. This suggests that the radiation they feared was not nuclear, but something more esoteric: spiritual radiation, the light of the gods. There is also the matter of the third party. The notebook instructions imply a schedule set by someone else. Be at agreed place, agreed with whom. Police investigations at the time chased shadows, looking for a mysterious blonde man seen talking to the victims, or a spiritual guru who might have coerced them. But no facilitator was ever charged. The instructions stand as a one-way communication. Whoever or whatever was on the other end of that agreement never stepped out of the shadows. The signal remains the variable that cannot be solved. Was it a flare, a car headlight flashing on a distant road, a hallucination induced by the capsules? Or was it the orange light seen by the watchman? The ambiguity is what keeps the case alive. If they had simply been poisoned, it would be a murder. If they had died of exposure, a tragedy. But the preparation, the masks, and the waiting transform the deaths into a modern myth. In the end, the notebook is a testament to the fatal power of suggestion. It proves that with the right combination of technical jargon and mystical promise, rational men can be led to their own destruction. They sat in the rain, blinded by lead, waiting for a transmission that would justify their existence. The signal they waited for has not faded. It has simply changed frequency, broadcasting a warning across the decades about the dangers of seeking answers in the dark. We are left listening to the static, wondering what they heard in those final moments, and hoping that we are not tuned to the same channel.